You could have heard this episode 40 hours early on our Patreon, patreon.com/Indieheads Podcast. By joining us for as low as $1 a month, you'll receive episodes early and gain access to our Discord server. All of our upcoming episodes, including this series, will be up on our Patreon 48 hours before it hits our public podcast feeds. If you're hearing this via our Patreon feed, we thank you so much for your support. We especially want to thank our Real Ones patrons, including Tony DeSofrofino, Chris Wade, Selectric, David Colbert, Maze Farms, Bex, Georgia Mikowski, AJ Moser, Rachel Hartman, Noah Kurtz, Waffle113, Alex Bilovich, Alec Felder, Adam Edwards, Jackson Christ, Elizabeth F., and Derek Pemberton. To become a Real One, consider supporting us with a $5 a month donation where you'll receive bonus episodes every month and get a shout out at the top of the pod. But before we begin this episode, we'll be doing a live stream next Friday, March 19th at 8 p.m. Eastern on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Indieheads Podcast. Myself, Gavin, Alex, AJ, and special guest Barely March will be put through the gauntlet of weird YouTube videos as we celebrate the culture of call commercial music. We'll be joined by various guests and friends throughout the stream, so once again, it'll all be happening next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on youtube.com/Indieheads Podcast. Anyways, though, enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Indieheads Podcast. We are in part 2 of the Gremlin Mindset Guide, Volume 1. Of course, we talked about the years 2010 to 2016 in our previous episode, going through records from The Drones, Girl Band, Proto-Martyr, Daughters, Scott Walker, Liars, Gorilla Toss, and more. But now we are on to part 2 as we are looking at the years 2017 to 2019 for the proto-Gremlin canon. Of course, once again, joined by Rose, DJ Horsejeans, Natalie. Let's just get right back into it. Our next record in the proto-Gremlin canon is Priest, Nothing Feels Natural, which came out just a few weeks after Trump was officially inaugurated the White House.
I mean, we picked a good point of inflection because this is an important point to signify, and a very, very appropriately timed album, but also like this album, like any other album that was released in the months of January and February 2017, was saddled with baggage it did not know it was going to be saddled with. Like I compared this in my review to We Got It From Here, Thank You to Your Service, because they're both albums that were written before Trump was elected, but then were then immediately looked through the lens of being Trump albums. And I think that maybe might have been why I didn't get into it at first, besides maybe just that this wasn't the kind of punk music I was listening to as much at the time. But like, the more that time has passed, the more I have gotten into this album, because this album is not a reaction to Trump. And the reason why we know that is because the most important Priest lyric of all time is Barack Obama killed something in me and I'm going to get him for it. And like this album, the way I described it in my write-up, which you should go read on the Indieheads Podcast Substack. If you're not already subscribed, do it. It's going to be great.
Substack.com.
Baby. But if you read my whole thing, I talk about Gremlin music and how it's not as didactically political, but abstractly political, to respond to the absurdism of being alive now, and how ridiculous, like in the way that we can't do like parody comedy SNL anymore because things are too ridiculous. Like the absurd requires an absurd response, and I think Priests are a great band at this, because they managed to combine explicitly political lyrics that have a POV with a abstract, like we talked about in the last episode, like the sense of detachment and the sense of feeling outrage, but also feeling like, what is the point of my outrage? Because I feel completely powerless to do anything tangible about the world that we've all been built into. And at first I didn't know if this was going to be a band in the Gremlin canon, because I think they are a little more accessible in certain ways than other of these bands, because like if you listen to like JJ, like they do have senses of pop and melody, and they do have kind of some maybe more traditional song structures. But then I mean, you listen to Appropriate right now, which is playing like, I don't know how I ever thought this band wasn't Gremlin music, when the first lyrics that happen when the guitars kick in on this album is, I've ate maggots, I've tasted bugs, I ate maggots, I've tasted bugs. And there are 5 different refrains in that song that we just heard that are so fucking catchy and so evocative. Like, I love the whole passage of the song that I quoted in my Substack. It's a long movie, a long movie, and you are not you, you are not you, contestant, contestant, you're on Wheel of Fortune, you're on Wheel of Fortune, over and over and over again. It's just like, it's exactly what the Gremlin mindset is all about. It is simultaneously a metaphor that you can break down and have intellectual thoughts about, but mainly it exists for you to stomp around like a maniac in your house too. And this whole album is just, I was really blown away because I knew I wanted to include it in the canon, but when I came back to it I was like, wait, is this album like amazing? Like, I thought this album was good, but I was just like blown away with how, I mean, Natalie, you were talking in the chat about how this album is like 33 minutes and not a single second of it is at all wasted. It's just this like efficient machine, and I love it.
Yeah, that's I had a similar response where I liked it quite a bit when it dropped, but I feel like revisiting it now was kind of one of those things where, like, looking back with hindsight, it's kind of like the sense of efficiency at play here, and the exact kind of like specific and yet abstract or like deliberately vague lyrical style where like Katie Greer will throw out a hyper specific line, but because you don't have any context for it, you're just kind of left to wonder what the fuck it even means or how it fits into the context of everything else. That all of that like really hit me. One part that I did want to like touch on, because you mentioned how like JJ is like one of the few songs that kind of has that like very sort of melodic structure to it. Mm-hmm. But I feel like something that hit me kind of going back to it for this and like looking at it in this context is just the number of songs that just kind of lock into one groove or like one sort of like rhythmic pattern, and even when like the song shifts into a refrain, it'll like lock into that. So I'm thinking stuff like No Big Bang or like Pink White House, where like it's moving between these different song sections, but what the band is doing often just kind of stays the same and stays static and kind of keeps you in that like hypnotized state that I feel like is really vital to like Gremlin music.
Yeah, and I feel like, especially, like, I think the best epitomization of this is, I don't know if y'all have listened to it, but the extended version of the closer, Suck.
Yes.
You know, that EP, like, so they made a 6.5-minute version of it, which just, like, completely sticks with that groove the entire way through, and it's brilliant in a way, because, like, it is admittedly a little bit too melodic to really be considered Gremlin at that point, because, you know, they've got, like, full-on woodwind sections, although, you know, like, we could debate about that because, you know, there's other Gremlin bands who've done just that.
I think I said in the intro that I do make exceptions, and I think Priests are like the perfect exception because they only use melody to communicate. Like, this is an emotional album in certain ways, and they use it like sparingly and like very pointedly, as opposed to like having it be like kind of the whole thing that they're, because they have the JJ and Suck and songs that have more of that kind of surf rock feel to them, more so than like hard edge post punk. But then you've got Appropriate, you've got Pink White House, you've got like the freak out moments that sound more like their sound on Bodies in Control and Money and Power, which I also love and also thought about including in the canon, because And Breeding and Doctor are just two of my favorite punk songs of the 2010s. But I think that Nothing Feels Natural is like their best album, their definitive document as a band. Like, I really hope that Priests, they're on an indefinite hiatus now, basically saying that like they were at a point in their band where they were kind of having an identity crisis after their bass player left and not really sure exactly what it is that they wanted to do, and sort of, instead of trying to force it, basically said, let's take a hiatus, let's go work on our own music, and like we'll come back together if it makes sense. And I hope it makes sense, and I hope maybe they find a different. I liked Seduction of Kansas. I think that album got more hate than it deserved, just because it had the misfortune of coming after Nothing Feels Natural and they're going for a different sound on that album. And they were doing that whole like, we're not a punk band thing, we're a rock band, which is a can of worms I don't even want to get into. But like I think that this album is the album where like the raw promise of Bodies in Control and Money and Power like really comes together in something that feels very very polished in that it's like super duper well put together and structured, but is completely unhinged in its delivery. And Katie Alice Greer is like, I think, one of my Hall of Fame Gremlin vocalists. Like the shit
She's
that she
so
is
good at it.
doing on this album is unbelievable. Like the line delivery of every single line, they bounce around my head like a pinball. And all the time I'll wake up in the morning and I have Katie Alice Greer yelling, "New hope for the great unwashed, new hope for the great unwashed," like over and over in my head. Like it's so catchy, but also so deranged.
Couple digressions here, I guess. First of all, I think Seduction of Kansas is actually their best record, but that's not a debate I
Wow.
want to get into. And
Wow.
secondly, I
Hot
think
takes.
I'm aware that is a hot take, but I believe in it fully. And secondly, I think one of the songs on here, JJ, gets into a very important secret trait of the Gremlin mindset, which is wanting to be a cowboy.
Oh hell yes! I love that chorus so much.
Yeah.
The cowboy.
We'll-
Smoke ray.
Jordan Greer.
We'll get into it.
He only
on-
wears
on-
two kinds of hats. He either wears a cowboy hat or like a Stussy hat. That's it. No in betweens.
God, I really want to
we'll
see.
get into it.
I really want to see. This is a total non sequitur, but I have to say this. I really, really would like to see Jordy Greep in like suspenders and like a belt, like a pants that are like pulled up above his waistband, and like the world's biggest cowboy hat. Like I'm imagining that in my head right now, and I would like him to
200-gallon
like
hat.
Look, all I'm saying is GL Jaguar in Priests, there was a time where he would wear a cowboy hat every time he performed. And Black Midi, they're already halfway there. They have a song called Western. We'll get into it.
What I'm saying is the Gremlin mindset means you want to be a cowboy. It's not that far.
Because look, I do like we're joking, but like that's really what it is. That being a cowboy, or at least this idea of obviously in terms of what actually is
The American myth of the cowboy.
The American myth of cowboy is true and utter freedom, and that is what the Gremlin mindset represents. At the end of the day, it is true and utter freedom from the human body and the spirit. It's just letting it's pure vulnerability, and not vulnerability in that like you're. Like not that kind of vulnerability where you go to the therapist and you tell you all your secrets and stuff. I mean vulnerability, just the feeling of it, of just like letting yourself go to the music. And I think this record at time really does get at that. Like
I actually just in this moment made the decision that you won't get what you want is in the Gremlin canon, because what you're talking about is 100% the part in Ocean song where he breaks free and he's like, I don't want to live in a house. I don't want to have a job. I don't want to have to be a person in this society. I want to sprint and run as fast as I can and be and go return to monkey. That is really what Gremlin Mindset is about. It is about the return to monkey.
If Ocean Song had a video with
Wait.
as monkeys.
Yes.
I was gonna say like Coldplay is part of the Gremlin canon.
Oh my god, Coldplay is part of the Gremlin canon. Adventure
we
of a
gotta
Lifetime.
Ask Chris Martin what his thoughts are on like
you did convince me, Horse Jeans, about You Won't Get What You Want, and I feel like if I revisit it now, like especially with the context of having written all of this and like discussing it with all of you, I feel like I'll kind of my mind will sway. I think I'll come to that side.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
There's a tweet from friend of the show or new friend of the show, Sasha Geffen, a recent viral tweet from them. I don't think anyone should have to hustle. I think everyone should get to live in a nice house and do nothing if they want. And that's truly the spirit of the Gremlin mindset. It is screaming your head off enough that maybe hopefully they just let you into a nice house and you just get to stay there. And it's great. But
just give me like a warm meal every now and then. I'll be chill.
Exactly. But like I said, whenever y'all just say about Priest, that's it was like I say, this is a great record. I've been on the Priest train, or at least this record's train since it came out. It was very early on the year contender. In 2017, I am not a Seduction of Kansas fan. I on a level I appreciate what they were trying to go for, but it is very clearly like a band going through an identity crisis.
Isn't that a Congleton record?
Yep, that's a Congleton joint.
Congleton
Oh, yeah,
record.
Rose is a Congleton
Again,
freak.
it's like Congleton, he either gives you the best records of your career or he gives you the one that everyone fucking hates.
And some people disagree about
Sometimes it's both.
actually often that's what happens is that John Congleton
Yep.
does your record and half of the fans will be like, this fucking sucks and I hate it so much, and the other half of the fans are like, this is the best album they've ever done.
Literally, like, the most important case study of this is fucking AJJ. Like,
I was gonna say She Who Shall Not Be Named, but
no, I wasn't gonna mention that.
Well, I feel like that's
I'm not
for
talking about
everyone's
weird. Listen,
opinions on that. Everyone's like, yeah, no, like her best.
Daddy is en route. Okay, he's not home yet.
what if Daddy's Home? What if she had the whole advertising campaign where she's like, it's a 70s warm Wurlitzer and wit, and then what if the album was a Gremlin album produced by Dan Carey? That would rule. I would love that.
Daddy's Home. I really
Me
do.
neither. That's my problem. I don't want to like this.
The only Daddy's Home that there's room for in my heart is the video that I have shared on Twitter multiple times that Gavin sent me of the BDSM butt rock song called Daddy's Home. That is the only butt rock Daddy's Home we recognize in this household.
Okay. Before we move on, I just want to give a quick shout out to Puff. That's a great song.
Puff rules. Hell yeah.
It's my favorite song on the record, honestly. It's extremely underrated. But
Also, shout out to Katie Alice Greer's like solo EPs that she's been putting out. There's like a really wide variety there. I especially recommend Three Colors. Like, that has one of my favorite songs she's ever written on there. It's called Virgin Mary Fanfic.
okay.
God, she rules so much. Big fan.
Alrighty.
Amazing.
Well, our next record in the Gremlin canon is Warm Bodies' self-titled release, which came out on April Fool's Day 2018. And Natalie, you have been a huge proponent for this record. I think, did you?
Yes.
I was going to say, did you get this into our decade list?
Yes. This ended up on my decade list just because when this came out in 2018, I'm pretty sure I found it through the one and only time that Pitchfork has ever covered them by reviewing it. And the appeal of something this unchecked and this feral naturally just like called out to me, and the like feral part of my brain just like fully latched onto it and never really let go. And it's funny that whenever I realized this came out on April Fool's Day, that like makes perfect sense, because Warm Bodies are kind of like one of those bands where you're not sure if it's just like an elaborate troll, like what they're going through, like their sound and like their lyrics and just the absurdities they take their songs to. But I don't know, I find it like very fascinating in this compelling way that it kind of bandwagons off of what we were just talking about with some of Priest qualities, because I feel like for me, when I think of bands that like give themselves fully to like making Gremlin music and like really fully propel themselves into it, pushing their body to the limits, like this is the album that like comes to mind for me. Just for one thing, just for how it sounds, which is this really bizarre subversion of like surf punk, where every band member is playing like a full like 20 to 40 BPM faster than you've heard like anything else in the genre. And then you have Olivia Gibb, the front woman, basically screeching these inhuman howls like at the top of her register, and to the point where it renders the words like almost completely unintelligible. But also like so much of the lyricism, when you do get down to it, and you really have to like search it out because it is so hard to figure out what the fuck Olivia Gibb is saying on this album, are like these really fascinating, grotesque sort of like miniature like body horror things, where so much of it is rooted around kind of like the limits of like human mortality and like reducing flesh and skin and all of these things that represent the corporeal down to like their signifier, down to kind of like the idea that they are just a symbol of like our own sort of like mortal life. And it feels like in that regard, like the ways in which the band projects themselves like instrumentally, production wise, like are pretty much exactly kind of like what they're doing within their lyrics. I'm mostly, whenever I think about it, I think of the song I Need a Doctor, which basically has her giving a vocal performance that like if you were an unsuspecting person, you would imagine that like she would be having like an actual like medical crisis on this song. It sounds like she is in legitimate physical pain, like she is like on the verge of like basically like mortal peril. And the ways in which the entire sort of like very fast guitars and drum fills and constant shrieking just kind of like always represents that in a way that feels like the band has been possessed by gremlins and they're just kind of like letting them all just go with it and just put it all to record. It's I don't know, whenever I think of kind of like the idea of a band being possessed by gremlin energy, I just kind of think of whatever the fuck is going on this album.
I mean, the very first song on this album is "I'm a Dog," and I think the lyrical style of that should be all the indication you need that this is a Gremlin rock album when you combine it with the sonic character. And also, "I Need a Doctor," very, very, very different than the Dr. Dre song "I Need a Doctor." Very not at all the same in any other way.
Never would have guessed.
This is the type of song you would imagine needs a title. "I Need a Doctor," because it sounds
actually
like yes.
This is
but
no,
that's that what you were saying about like even how the album starts is it starts with this sort of like positioning of like the firmly animalistic, kind of what we were again just talking about, is this sense of just like the first thing you hear is the vocalist basically being like, I'm basically a feral animal. Here is me unleashing myself onto this record for the next 20 minutes in that mode.
Yeah, this album is very sick. I was really glad that you recommended it for the canon because I hadn't listened to it before, and I was like, oh yeah, hell yeah, this totally belongs. It's really clever and tongue-in-cheek in the way that I really, really love, there's an incredible joke in the track listing, the song D.B. Cooper, which is like, it's D.B. Cooper as in the famous guy who hijacked an airplane and jumped out of the sky, but it's written as like D-flat Cooper. Anyways, I think that's very funny.
I have been with this album for like 3 years and I just noticed that, so thank you for that.
Hell yeah, this band is great. They're just fucking wild in the way that makes it very obvious why they're a fit for the great. This is not one of those albums that we've talked about that's like kind of on the cusp and you can make arguments either way. This is fully post society, I mean, the cover art is perfect. It's literally crayon drawn and it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think we discussed when we were talking about like selecting albums that like Gremlin album covers are like two formats. It's like pictures of architecture or like similarly kind of like very sort of staid like drawings, like kind of like Proto-Mars Agent Intellect cover, or it's like the most like feral crew drawing that you can imagine, and this is like a perfect fit for that.
Yeah, it's there's a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum is the Silence Yourself cover, and on the other end of the spectrum is the Warm Bodies cover.
Alrighty. Well, let us move on to our next sacred text in the Gremlin Mindset. So we're going to skip over a couple because, again, we have a very important one at the end. We want to make sure that we really focus our energy. We're building up, all right? It's coming close to midnight. We got to be ready when it comes through. So our next record in the Gremlin canon, I think actually I want to discuss this one because I do think it was one that was on the cusp. Yeah. And I do want to hear some defense for it. The Lithics record, Meeting Services, which came out on May 25th, 2018. Horse James, you're the one who picked this one. I listened to a little bit of it today. I didn't get a chance to get through it all because we had to record the pod. But why? Actually, I did actually listen to one on the fly. I didn't get to the last 2 or 3 on here. But why this record? Why is this a Gremlin canon text to you?
So I wanted to include this because there are a couple of bands that I think, like I've talked about, subvert the kind of crazy off the cut, like what we've been talking about this whole time of going feral. Like, I think that this band seems like maybe it shouldn't qualify because the vocal delivery of the lead singer on this album is very, very understated. Like, she kind of it's mixed. The way it's mixed is this album is a little more minimal than a lot of other Gremlin albums, and it's also like she's doing more of like a spoken word kind of thing than she is like fully letting go. But what the result of that is it really lets like the instrumentation here shine, and this is the specific blend of like dance punk and math rock that is going on here is like, I think to me, like very close to the textbook definition like musically of like what this whole genre is all about. And I think when you listen to Mating Services, it's an album that it took a while for me to get fully into it because it is a little bit like samey. Like they're in such a particular pocket and they are so good at making this particular kind of song that the first time I was listening to it, I was like, it kind of feels like they're doing similar things throughout it. But the more time I've had to sit with it, the more I've really dug into it. I really enjoy it. I think a couple of the really good, there are a couple of songs on here that are just fine, but the highlights, like there are so many like really crucial, like Excuse Generator is so great, Edible Door is so great, the closing track Dancing Guy is incredible. And I think that they are, the fact that she is less crazy vocally allows the musical complexity of the band to really shine through. And like we were talking about with those other bands, like this is a band where the bassist and the drummer are like really in sync, even though they'll often start tracks, like a lot of Gremlin rock tracks will start with like, you'll have one beat and then the other element will like awkwardly introduce itself and you're like, what the hell, this sounds like it's about to fall apart. And then all of a sudden it just locks into a groove that doesn't make any sense, but like you feel it in your feet. And I really think that the kind of like almost like the percussive way that she does her spoken word doesn't make it feel like she's just like holding back. It helps carry the energy of the track while also being decidedly more minimalist than a lot of these other bands. And I think the guitar tone on this album is like, again, textbook definition of like what the Gremlin sound is. Like when you listen to the guitars on this album and you listen to like the whole Gremlin rock playlist, like you can really, this is a really clear example of what it is without using words like angular that don't really mean anything.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, like I said,
I like this band a lot. They're more on the dance punk side of things, I would say, and are a little bit like the odd one out here in some ways. But I do think that this album is important for the canon, and I really like this album a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, alrighty. So, yeah. So I do agree that Dancing Guy though is like, okay, like that is a Gremlin song. Like I said,
yeah.
Sometimes it's not entire records. Sometimes it is just some singles or like an EP. But
I mean, we did albums for the proto list. I think we'll probably expand it to EPs because the thing that's happened, like these are big works that are like kind of seeding the influences of these other bands. But then what happens around post Black Midi is that this starts to explode. And like I talked about, like I will listen to any British person with a guitar, and there are so many like one-off EPs and singles. And I swear to God, every week Dan Carey finds some other fucking group of musicians that are also really good. And so I think what we were looking for on this list was we were looking for what can we identify that are full-length albums that really help you get a sense of what this music is all about and kind of complete statements. As we're talking about, we're not these are not just good Gremlin rock songs. These are sacred texts that we are enshrining on the wall. We're lighting a sacred candle for each one. It's a very it's a very elaborate process.
Mm-hmm. Well, alrighty. So we have two more sacred texts to go that we're going to talk about. There's, again, we're going to, unfortunately, because of time, we're going to skip over the Surfboard record. We're going to skip over the Show Me the Body record. But before we get to, of course, the Gremlin Kings themselves, Poko Birthday is our latest entry, is the next entry into the Gremlin canon, and which came out, let's see, on February 22nd, 2019. Natalie, this is one of your picks. Why does this deserve to be in the Gremlin canon?
So I want to say, quick thing is, fun fact, this actually did come out on my birthday of that year, which is something that is always just kind of really nice for me.
Hey.
And really fun. But This one is another one that I would feel is on the cusp, and I would honestly say that just because we now have a second text from Poko, their really great album Cheater from this year, that one is one that I feel like is decidedly not Gremlin, just because a lot of the elements that I feel like make this one are kind of absent. That one has a lot more direct kind of like almost kind of pop song structures in their own very unique way. There's less repetition, there's less kind of like weird time signature stuff going on a lot of the time. But like this one is one that like I honestly feel like it's not particularly Gremlin all of the time, but there is enough of it that kind of fits the Gremlin mold that like every time I just kind of listen to this album, I tap into like the Gremlin section of my brain. The thing that kind of was the deciding factor when I was going through this again is just the fact that so much of this is dependent on these kinds of like constantly repetitive locked in grooves that are going in throughout the entire time, where there are eventual builds that kind of take off, but when they do take off they just kind of skyrocket out of nowhere. There's like not really much build up, and when there is, there's little variation in like the vocal inflection or like changes in the words. Like the song that I selected for this that's playing now, theme number 1, is this 2-minute intro song where Ragnhild, the vocalist, just keeps repeating sublime, sufficient, over and over until you are just unsure of what that even means, what that applies to. Is this like a mantra for the band? Is this them describing themselves? Is this, as the song itself goes into with its like second little like repeated phrase, a song literally about the Miyazaki film Poko, or the Ghibli film I should say?
It's a Takahata, yes.
Yes.
Or is it about the band Sublime themselves? Who knows?
Who knows? Who is to say?
Like, yeah, there's like a few songs that like throughout the album just kind of do this same sort of trick over and over, but each time with like a different slant on it. So there's Crazy Energy Night, which kind of is locked into this like almost kind of unhinged dance punk groove the entire time, has this single line repeating over and over kind of in a similar way. And the way in which the instrumentation on this album kind of manifests itself is always in this, to lazily borrow a term, kind of like angular mindset, where it's like taking the foundations of like very sort of like post-punk type guitar tones, but like infusing them with this like almost kind of like candy colored like tint to them, almost like you've basically like let a small creature out in like a candy factory and it's just kind of like going nuts all over the place. It's an album that I feel like when it kind of does go in that direction, and it like either is kind of locked into its like monotone repetition, or it's like very unique kind of vocal style, which is not quite melodic but almost kind of has this like serrated edge to like how things are happening. Like Ragnhild's vocals are such that they do not really resemble any sort of traditional tonality. Like the way that she sings is like not necessarily perfectly like correct in a way that like we kind of wrap our heads around it, but it makes sense for just how jagged and weird the sounds and tones are throughout the rest of the album. And so it's one that I feel like is not quite as informative of like some of the like Black Midi-esque type stuff that comes forward, but I feel like is very informative for a lot of the sort of more energetic forms of like Gremlin rock that we see, especially in the last couple of years, especially in the fact that so much of this, the lyricism from Poko, both on this album and on Cheater, are just this strange sort of like mishmash of a bunch of different sentiments that just do not really make sense when you combine it together. And part of that may be because the band is Norwegian and English is not their first language, but also because there's a constant like dark undercurrent going throughout some of the brighter songs here, where there's like songs about stalking somebody who has like basically like not returned your affection. There's one where Ragnhild is basically singing about like going undercover to hide from something, but that something is never quite mentioned. There's this weird sense of paranoia that's going on throughout the entire album that I think kind of captures a lot of the sort of lyrical slants to some Gremlin records that we have talked about and will talk about going forward.
Well, alrighty then. That was Poko's birthday, but it is time for the most sacred of sacred gremlin text when we talk about the gremlin mindset.
The moment where it tips over, where the water gets on the Mogwai and the gremlins are truly let loose. We all know that the origin of this, as we talked about, was BM, was that first that one and only Black Midi album that we are waiting on the second follow. I loved AJ's meme in the chat, which was like an impact font. F. Schlagenheim is the best Black Midi album. Controversial opinion or whatever, but this album, like you're saying, it's just massive. There's a before and after of when this album hits, and you can really tell that, like, in addition to just the influence of Dan Carey, who is the producer of this album, is the label head of Speedy Wonderground, which is a record label out of Britain that has produced many of the most important Gremlin rock bands, including Black Midi and Squid and all sorts of other artists, but Black Country New Road. But you look at this album and it has so many of those tenets that we were talking about. It's got the way it swings wildly from one style and groove from another, the way it, obviously Jordy Grieve is the Gremlin frontman, like what he's doing on this album, not only combining, he combines every style in the book. Like, he sings beautifully sometimes, but then sometimes he will literally sound like just little gremlin sound effect noises, and then other times he will say she moves with a purpose is just the one that, like, really unlocked all of our brains, because, like we've talked about, like, as it keeps repeating, it's like when you look at a word for too long and you're like, okay, I think that's how that word is correctly spelled, but for whatever reason it just looks wrong to my brain right now. Like, why does that word have a letter in it? Like, the more he keeps saying she moves with a purpose and saying it in every Daffy Duck ass different vocal reading he says it, like, it just loses all its meaning. And then the fact that the sampled weird screamings that are in the background is also, like, they are really the band that takes the instrumental rock influences of this decade and combines them with, I mean, they've cited Death Grips as, like, a really big inspiration of this album, and they're combining it with this crazy collage-like structure to their songs, where they're just like, we are going to jam for a long time and come up with all these musical ideas, and we're going to throw them together into a pot that doesn't seem like it should make any sense, and it totally does. And I think the key to that all working, I really think I gotta give it up to Black Midi's drummer, who, when I saw them live for the first time and watched him do all of these rapid shifts and switches and grooves and directions, like, he is the compass that keeps this band from just completely falling off the face of, like, intelligibility and comprehension. Like, he's just one of the best drummers. What is it? Morgan Simpson, the drummer?
Morgan Simpson, yes.
Yep.
Yes, he is a real fucking talent, and I think he's one of the many reasons why I think this record is just so massive and so one of the best debuts, I mean, like, of this decade in a long time. It's just so fully formed. Like, it really feels like they were locked away somewhere in some dark castle, and they were unleashed upon the world just as this fully formed virus, this plague upon music, in a good way, though.
Yeah, it kind of, to tie things all together, like, back to what we were, like, talking about way back with Gay Disco, it, like, really feels like he is the glue that holds all of these, like, very strange shifts and, like, riffs, if you could even call them that, or, like, Jordy Grieve's whatever the fuck he's doing vocally, like, whatever phrases he's throwing out, and makes it sound like it's an intentional piece of music coming together, rather than, like, a bunch of people just kind of going to town on their instruments and, like, a short king being feral on the mic. It's
Yes.
like, not that he is not, because he is still very much that, but, like, I think one of the things that I had mentioned when I was revisiting this earlier today, and I mentioned it in our like chat, was how even with the like breadth of different albums that we've talked about, that we've been like kind of building up to chronologically, and like seeing all the groundwork laid out and being able to like identify pieces of Gremlin DNA, specifically like Black Midi Gremlin DNA in like all of these other albums, this album still feels like very much like nothing else, and it feels like a fully like unique product that like only they could have made. It really truly feels like they're taking all of these elements and putting such a wild spin on how they all come together that the end product creates this utter chaos in a way that like none of the other albums even like particularly sing to. As much as I love a bunch of the other albums that we have talked about, it like really kind of feels like brain being cracked open, being touched by forbidden knowledge.
Oh my god, yes. I
Not
love
gonna lie, she is moving with a purpose though.
she do be moving with a purpose.
I've gotten word that she may or may not be moving with some form of purpose.
What you were saying though is so true though. It's like there is such a fine, delicate line you have to walk between chaos that is still like that you can still jam to, that is still intelligible, that is still like you feel it in your body, but that also has this unpredictability, like because they can go in any direction musically seemingly at the drop of a hat, and their drummer can just like do that without having to break a sweat. That allows them to do all these crazy shifts without ever making the listener feel like you're lost, or like this band doesn't, you don't know where it's going, but you can always tell that they know where it's going. And when you combine that with the fact that at any point you have absolutely no idea what Jordy Griep is going to do or say or be possessed by the spirit of, and that creates a listening that like no matter how much I listen to this album, you will always be like, as long as you take some time off before you return to it, there's always going to be something that like really smacks you in the face. Like, I forgot that it does that. What the hell? Like, there's so many ideas and nuggets for you to just latch onto over time as you keep returning to it over and over again. And yeah. I think we were not at all wrong to hype this album as much as we did right when it came out. Like, it really does feel like a seismic shift.
Yeah, it feels. Oh, I was just gonna say, it feels really like that sort of instant classic. And I want to say we have the same brain there, because like I'm thinking about like demonic possession as the force that kind of possesses Jordy Griep, particularly whenever he blasts off into whatever sort of howling and screeching and like random strings of like characters and phonetic intonations. It's like he's being like taken over by some sort of demonic entity that knows a bunch of other languages and is fluent in it. It's just coursing through his body. He's letting it just run right through.
Yeah,
and to go on that a bit, like, I think y'all talk about the chaos of it, but I kind of feel it's a very orderly album in a sense. Like, you can kind of track every song, like, even if the melodies feel off, like, you can track the basic structure of any, rhythmic section to, like, a good count. Like, like that opening track with 953, that ba 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 ba. Like, you can knock that down to a science, the way it kind of shifts, and, like, every 4 bars, like, they'll shift in that way. Like, it's just this very subtle sense of movement that you don't really check, and, like, you're actively, like, zoning in on that. But it's, like, such well-honed precision that, like, it's pretty genius, and it reminds me a lot of, to throw out an album that probably hasn't thought about in this conversation, I believe it's from 2008, Battles' debut, Atlas.
Oh yeah.
It reminds me a lot of that, in a way, like, specifically, like, that kind of, like, locking into very rigid structures and, like, morphing on them over and over, like, especially, I feel like Ice Cream by Battles is a very proto-Gremlin song.
Yeah. I feel like the one thing that we have like barely touched on here is sort of how a lot of math rock informs a lot of the more groove-centric Gremlin stuff that we've been talking about, especially kind of like the ones that have these very sort of atypical structures or time signatures that feel intentionally jagged, or like they're sort of like playing with the forms of the thing in a way that's supposed to catch you off guard and keep you on your toes. And I feel like this is definitely really clearly indebted to that in a way that, like, even among some of the other ones that we've talked about is, like, really, really vitally clear, especially in how some of those riffs work in such odd time signatures, but the sense of, like, precision and kind of, like, locked inness that everybody is, like, on top of at the same time always feels like you're with it even when it is kind of, like, taking those very strange routes.
Yeah.
And like, definitely, I think my favorite track on this album is still, like, to this day, even before the album, I was like, Speedway slaps so hard. Like, specifically just that, like, locked time group that they stay in for the entire time, even when, you know, the drums are, like, just rattling around doing all dozens of variations on that one pattern that, you know, like, just, it manages to find so many ways around the same thing. And that's something that I think is a strength to this album, is, like, you know, they can say the same thing 100 times musically or, like, in just words, but every time is a different variation. You know, he's not just saying, hey, she moves with a purpose. Like, you know, she's like, she moves with a purpose.
He found every single way to say that phrase, and he says all of them in that song.
And he still somehow finds new ways to say it live.
Oh, yes. Seeing them live is great, too, because you get to see, like, what a machine they are, and that they can perfectly recreate these seemingly, like, chaotic constructions, but then also that, like, you can tell by the way they perform them, like, oh, this is just really coming out of them. It's not like this elaborately put together thing. Like, there was one day in the studio where they just were jamming out for fun and all of a sudden stumbled their way into this fucking cacophony, and they're like, wait a second, this is really good. But what if over it, Jordy, you sang, I dream of a woman with the teeth of a raven and the hands of a porcupine, and they were like, that's genius. Put it on the album.
Best fucking line.
Go off, King.
Yeah. Oh no, yeah. I want to especially call attention to, since it's playing now, of Schlagenheim, which, like, really sort of nails that vibe, especially the section that's about to come up here, where for so much of the song, once it kind of kicks off into high gear, it's settled around this same kind of, like, groove. But, like, as things progress, they, like, very sort of subtly, like, up the tempo, or like Morgan Simpson is, like, doing all these, like, completely nutty things on, like, his drum heads, or, like, adding in extra kicks. And it's one of those things where, because of the locked inness, they're able to continually and perpetually just kind of add to the chaos in it in a way that is just so viscerally compelling to listen to.
Totally.
Yeah, that's the thing, is, like, they add layers in a progressive manner where, like, you can't tell when they plan to do it, but they know, because they're locked in with that simple precision. And that's something that I think is so key to it, is, like, precision.
Exactly.
Yeah. Ordered chaos, if you will.
I will try to stay off of any of redacted discussion. However, I do think I have been thinking a lot about Ween this week. I have been listening to a lot of Ween for reasons that will perhaps be explained on a future episode of the Indieheads podcast. But I've been listening to a lot of Ween, and the thing that is great about Ween is that they are insanely talented musicians who,
but they just fuck around.
Very often will intentionally make songs that are obnoxious as shit, and will very intentionally use their musical talents to do whatever dumb bullshit they are fascinated with. And I think Schlagenheim, Black Midi have that kind of a thing where they do this album does have feeling to it and ideas in it, and it's not entirely just like Jordy Greep saying bullshit like we've talked about. Like, somehow through absurd nonsense, these bands are able to communicate really potent ideas. Like Near Detroit, Michigan is a really great example of that, where even though they do it in a very abstract sort of way, you can tell, like, based on the song title and based on the lyrics, you can figure out what it's about. It's about the Flint water crisis and that sort of thing. But I really think that this whole album is a great example of that kind of the way that he's saying, like, nonsense bullshit. Like, he gets to have lyrics that, like, actually kind of affect you, but he also has lyrics, like, that are just, like, literally, like, completely just absurd, like hands of a raven, teeth of a porcupine, and because the instrumental is just so compelling that you, like, don't even have the mental capacity to process that he just said that the first time you hear it.
Yeah, and I feel like we gotta shout out the fact that, like, the other members of the band who each get their turn on vocals all kind of like add to the Gremlin energy in their own particular way. Like Speedway, as we mentioned, with this like very sort of like monotone sort of drone that kind of suckers you in and continues to build before it like yanks it all back. And then like Years Ago, where you just have this completely feral, distorted energy of just this riff on a weird viral talk show clip and like broken Polish going throughout. It is the kind of thing where they just like will throw all of these random things out there with this either scaled back or totally insane energy, and like the ways in which each band member is really tapped into the Gremlin mindset here and like really forwarding the ideas that we've been talking about that have come into play, I think is especially vital in how the record like sings as a whole.
Totally. And as I'm listening to this just now, I'm kind of realizing what makes Black Midi a great example of like when you can make exceptions to the singing rule, is that when Black Midi actually sing like they do on Western, or when they stumble into like a really beautiful section or a section that's like really melodic and traditional, it feels so weird. After what you've just been through, it like, yeah, it's like them returning to traditional structures is in its own way subversive, because you're like, so you've been so off disoriented by the first 4 tracks that like when he goes into like the kind of traditional balladry voice that he does on Western, you're just like, wait, what the hell? Like what's going on here? And I think that is what makes it so effective.
Yeah, and I mean, we're only a couple minutes away from him just going like
yes.
Yeah. Oh no, I distinctly remember the first time that I listened to this album, like when it was getting hyped up. It was like 9:53 is just like one of those openers that just throws you off right out of the gate of just being like, what the hell am I even listening to? Because it's like math rock but gremlin minded. And then when I got to this song, it's just one of those left field turns that, because it comes like smack in the middle of the album after so much chaotic energy before it, was just kind of like it really kind of felt like a moment where like it pushed me into galaxy brain mentality.
Yeah, I mean, like the first 4 songs on this album are like just intense, really speedy jams, and then this song is just like, okay, we're gonna slow it down. Okay, we're back again.
Yeah, it's the pacing in this is so wild.
It is an impeccably structured album. Like
it is, but it also shouldn't be. Like when I look at it on paper, on paper, I'm like, there's no way this should go down smooth, but it
like,
does.
How can you have the 8-minute, like the longest song in your album, be the middle of it? It makes no sense.
It does not make a lot of sense. I mean, when the very first Black Midi song I ever heard was the video for Speedway, was the very first song I ever heard, and even though that is not my favorite song on the album, I have not had an experience like listening to Speedway in a really long time. Like it really reminds me of Death Grips, where it's not just that, oh, this band is kind of weird, like it's the combination of these visuals and this instrumental style and this vocal style where I'm just like, is this an artifact from another dimension? Am I not supposed to see this? Like, it doesn't feel like music that is being marketed to me by a musician and an artist who is, it feels like it is an artifact from another world. And I think that's what the Gremlin music at its best can be. And I think that this album, I mean, it's just a classic. It's the text from which we have drawn this whole theory from for a reason, because it's got all of the elements here.
Well, folks, it is my turn to speak. Honestly,
is it now?
Yeah, there was a little error earlier where my mic was muted and I was trying to introduce this record, so you won't hear that in the final version, but there's the official lore. I mean, honestly, what y'all said, I have nothing else much to say other than like, this record, I mean, more or less, like for me, when I think about this record, obviously I think about their set at Pitchfork 2019, the goddamn Mud Pit, the perfect way to experience Black Midi in a pit full of just characters just getting extremely fucking dirty. There's a photo of me and AJ right after that set where my pants are ruined. My shoes are caked in mud. I ruined my favorite Wise Blood shirt because of that fucking set. I'm still mad about that. But like, that's the thing with Black Midi, is that at the end of the day, when I listen to them, you got to give into the feeling, and that's what makes the record so special to me. Is that like with a lot of records, it's just like, okay, I'm thinking about what they're saying, and this is just, I give into the feeling, I give into my inner gremlin, and that's it. There's not, it's hard to articulate myself with this, how much I like this record so much. But obviously, I think we should mention, we mentioned this, I think, on part 1, but or at least in the pre-chat of an important document to articulating the Gremlin mindset, of course, is AJ's Indieheads Album of the Year 2019 write-up on Schlagenheim, which I will read the first part regarding the Gremlin mindset. I'm gonna throw over Ductor, because I think that's a perfect way to ramp up as I'm saying some of these things. Regarding the Gremlin mindset, the Gremlin understands that bodies are temporary vessels. Noxious and hellspawn, they acknowledge no structure nor code, seeking only momentum, carried by mindless fervor toward an irreconcilable pressure. They move with a purpose. Recognizing that a more orthodox authority exists only to become outdated and arrayed, the Gremlin lives by a code that is at once unspoken and cast in a bloody scripture, following not flat or a dict, but a feeling. Where prescripted statutes fails to harness them, they deny their traditional hierarchy and forgo all formality. Inscrutable and enigmatic, the Gremlin lives only as they move. What a magnificent purpose. And I'll keep going on some of these things. There's so many wonderful quotes throughout this record, throughout this thing. I could go on, but seriously, read the entire write-up. It is, I think, a fantastic descriptor of the feeling of the Gremlin mindset, of what it's like to embed yourself in it and live in it, and get really muddy in a pit with all your friends and whatnot, and a friend you haven't seen in 4 years, who you slept in a bed with in a shitty Airbnb in 2016. It's wonderful. Wonderful record. I love this record dearly. I think you all three said everything that needs to be said about it. Folks, she moves with a goddamn purpose. All right.
What a magnificent purpose.
What a magnificent purpose. But yeah, I think that'll do it for this episode. So of course, this is only volume 1 of the Gremlin Mindset. The Gremlin Mindset is, of course, it is ever evolving. It is constantly adding new scripture. It is like the constitution of the Indieheads podcast. We are adding on it. We are building amendments. New descriptors can come through. And of course, since the release of Schlagenheim and BM, there's been a lot of really great music that has popped up that we can define as Gremlin Mindset music. So
Dan Carey has been busy. He's been very busy in the last couple of years, and we will discuss all of his new children.
Exactly. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode here. Volume 2 of the Gremlin Mindset, hopefully coming later this summer. We will we'll see how things go, but we promise you there will be more, and we cannot wait to talk about more of this Gremlin music. We cannot wait to embed ourselves in the mindset, because it is the mindset that you have to be in when you're dealing with the things that we are currently dealing with in this country and in the world at large. So yeah, that'll do it. Hope you all enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
throwing